March 3, 1989, The Handwriting as Witness. It began with a sentence that landed like a thrown bottle at a neighborhood barbecue, casual, loud, and meant to wound. Years before the date that would come to matter, at a summer gathering where the smell of charred corn and cheap beer braided with the bright laugh of children playing in sprinkler spray, my father said, half in jest and half in the blunt habit of his voice, "You're an accident." The phrase hung in the open air where laughter should have absorbed it, and instead it settled, like ash, on everything. That careless line lodged in my history. For a very long time it seemed to define me in other people's mouths, a one-syllable verdict delivered over cold beer and grilled food. The proof that unmade me into a myth arrived not with fanfare but on a plain sheet of paper dated March 3, 1989. The letter was domestic rather than forensic. It was the sort of evidence that accumulates quietly and with stubborn, everyday logic. The handwriting itself testified, a pause long enough between ascenders and descenders, a steady horizontal strike on the T, a small decisive loop on the G. Those were not decorative choices. They were dialect habits as telling as the cadence of a voice. When I hold that page now, the steadiness in the ink feels like a hand placed at my back. The sentences read like scaffolding rather than ornament, insistences that choice matters, that safety is a kind of work and often a private one, that practical acts of protection outlast the noise of public humiliation. I remember where I was when I first read it aloud, at the kitchen table mapped with unpaid bills and the small clutter of domestic life. It was winterlight through the curtains, the neighborhood beyond the window muffled by a wet glaze, and the sound of the refrigerator cycling. Certain lines lodged in me with the ledger's insistence: speech has consequences, domestic care can be armor. If I could give one blunt practical answer to hindsight, it would be this: begin keeping records sooner. Photocopy important letters, note dates, tuck receipts into envelopes, write down who was present when a damaging sentence was spoken. We treat clerical work as pallid and ancillary. Over the decade that followed, it proved otherwise. Clerical habits are infrastructure. They support truth as surely as beams support a roof.
1989 bis 1991, Aftermath and Quiet Cataloging.
The months following March 3 felt oddly bifurcated. In public the old joke persisted in soft echoes. Privately there was a new, quieter labor. I began making lists the way one might tend a garden, not to dig up old roots for revenge but to keep living. I recorded dates of conversations, small disagreements, the places where the family gathered. Slow, domestic cataloging replaced fury for the most part. This was not the heroic act of a courtroom but the nightly ritual of attention, an entry on a legal pad, the name of a friend who had heard an insult, the date of a backyard barbecue. It became clear that there are different forms of justice, and that one of them operates through repetition. Show what happened often enough and the world begins to see it differently. 1992 to 1996, the worksheet of intimacy. Intimacy carries a peculiar moral labor, not the rhetoric of sacrifice but a grittier bookkeeping. In those early 90s years we learned to measure things differently. An argument condensed into a sentence at a party was treated as an event with consequences. Times were recorded, witnesses noted, small scraps taped into envelopes. At first it felt absurd, the domestic equivalent of building a fortress out of post-it notes. Then it felt necessary. Those years were also years of cultural transition. The public discourse around family, privacy, and responsibility was shifting in fits and starts. While the wider world debated rights and recognitions at the national level, on our kitchen table the argument took a different form. How do you protect someone's integrity within a family that tells itself stories to get by? The letter of March 3, 1989, did not erase fires of anger or make sudden absolution possible. It could not undo the fact that my father had used language as a weapon. What it did, slowly, was create a structure that freed me from being endlessly defined by a single careless sentence. The transformation was quietly radical. Being raised by someone ceased to be the sole interpreter of who I was. People could fail us, and yet other evidence could hold a fuller shape of the person. 1997, passing the tool forward. By the spring of 1997, my daughter was 8. This was the late 1990s, a decade when children's lives were beginning to be archived in new ways as digital cameras and early home computers entered common parlance, but our methods remained stubbornly physical. She was small and theatrical, a child who loved gestures that startled and steadied us both. Preparing for a school play that year, she folded the script into her pocket and, as a private charm, slipped in a tiny scrap of paper bearing a single line from that old letter: "Family can be a choice as much as a fact." She told me one windy April afternoon that when her heart raced on stage she read the line and remembered she was meant. The scrap had become an incantation, not vindication but instruction. That transfer proved the letter's purpose. It was not merely a document to be framed, it was a practical tool, a piece of household technology that could be used in moments of personal fear and doubt.
2000 bis 2003. Rituals as insurance.
My father died in late 2001. Death reordered ordinary rhythms. Friends who were acquaintances drifted in with casseroles and awkward condolences. Certain obligations surfaced with surprising immediacy. In the first months after his death, the rhythm of the household shifted in both predictable and surprising ways. We introduced small rituals as a kind of insurance. The rituals were prosaic: a weekly file night every Friday for receipts and letters, an annual estate map noting passports, mortgage papers, and insurance policies. Into the same box went an inventory that felt oddly central, a record of who knew which family stories, who could corroborate what I remembered. At first these rituals were defensive, proof against being gaslit, a way to show how events had actually unfolded. Over time they softened into something curative. They honored the steady caretakers around us: my mother, who noted birthdays and obscure phone numbers with religious precision; a neighbor who saved recipes in a neat spiral notebook and dropped off a pie when winter tightened. The children liked the quiet authority of order. There is dignity in treating certain matters as serious by default, and that dignity ripples through a family in ways grandchildren eventually notice. 2002, training grounds for public life. The small arenas of public life, school plays, PTA meetings, block parties, book clubs, are improbable laboratories for narrative control. Between 1999 and 2008 we learned to treat those spaces as training grounds for an economy of response, to speak the literal when others preferred the sensational, to correct without theatricality, to name an untruth and then retire the confrontation. Once, at a block party in July 2002 where beer loosened tongues and a neighbor's young son chased a balloon across the lawn, someone made an aside about accidents, a laughing echo of the old backyard moment. I could have taken the stage and made it a spectacle. Instead I leaned in and named the falsity in a low voice, steering conversation towards something less combustible. The refusal to dramatize functioned as containment. Truth spoken without frenzy is hard to weaponize. 2003. Unexpected reparations. Other people supplied unexpected reparations, small gestures that meaningfully altered the ledger. On a winter evening in 2003, a man who had worked with my father for decades appeared at our door, with a thermos of soup and the awkwardness of sincere regret hanging about him like a coat. He did not offer a tidy apology that could undo the past. He offered stories, observations about my mother's small, steady ways, about a quiet competence in their neighborhood that had gone unnoticed by broader, louder narratives. In the shift of narrative that followed, one voice acknowledging another person's worth, the ledger diversified. It did not erase prior entries, it added complexity. When enough voices recalibrate, the record reflects nuance rather than a single humiliating anecdote. 2004. The capitals and the T. I remember my mother that summer at the kitchen table correcting the headings on envelopes I'd addressed in my chosen name. "You're insistent on capitals," she said, smiling at my jittery hand. "Capitals make things official," I replied, "because making something visible often makes it safer." She nodded as if that were a moral argument and then told stories. Luminous ones whispered for warmth, sharp ones struck like matches for necessary illumination. Her stories were the spine of our small household, examples of courage that had nothing to do with public correctness and everything to do with steadiness in private. That domestic insistence on form, the capital letters, the consistent date, became part of our ritual practice, a way to make life legible again. 2004 to 2010, family negotiations. Family rearrangement is not a one-moment theatrical unveiling but a long series of negotiations. My siblings navigated this shift differently. Some embraced archival rigor, aligning documents and memories into a coherent archive. Others clung to original timelines, resisting the invitation to rewrite them even when those timelines contained cruel jests. We negotiated these differences with tenderness and professional care. Evenings in my mother's living room could look like a small council: what to preserve, what to release, whether to remain publicly silent for the sake of an elder relative's pride. These debates were messy and sometimes lasted years, but they were necessary. Family is a long conversation that gains nuance when people disagree without forfeiting connection. Our arguments about civility, protection, and truth planted the seeds of a durable ethic. 2006 to 2012, Negotiations and Ethics. We argued about whether to remain silent to preserve an elder's pride. Some believed silence protected dignity, others insisted that silence preserved the lie. Nights passed with voices raised and abandoned dinners cooling on plates. In those debates we articulated values. Do we protect a reputation for the sake of peace, or do we preserve the dignity of those harmed by ensuring an accurate record? Our resolution was pragmatic: private archives paired with public corrections used sparingly and strategically. This compromise did not erase pain, but it guided action. It also generated a new family vocabulary about boundaries and responsibility: when to intervene, when to document, when to allow grief to reconfigure a narrative.
2008 bis 2010. Small public interventions.
The simplest interventions proved most effective. At a PTA meeting in September 2008, an easy joke threatened to become cruel. I offered a gentle correction and a change of subject. No dramatics. The person who joked could not spin the moment into a performance of victimhood. The quieter you are, the less oxygen an incident has to become a spectacle. In May 2010, at a school fundraiser, an offhand joke again threatened cruelty. I stepped closer, named the falsity calmly, and offered one short fact. No grandstanding. The moment lost oxygen and the conversation moved on. Truth functions best as repair, not theater. These small practices, soft corrections, offering a single fact, became our version of damage control, not to silence but to restore equilibrium. 2009 to 2014, Memory and Decline. As my mother aged, the letter became a resource for new difficulties. Early forgetfulness showed in mislaid keys and misplaced names. Later it arrived in larger ruptures, words that eluded her, afternoons when the thread of conversation frayed. On a rainy Tuesday in November 2011, after a slow afternoon, I sat at her bedside and read aloud the paragraph about choice and protection. She listened the way she had always liked things spoken back, and when I finished she squeezed my hand and said simply, "It needed saying." Her approval felt like a benediction. Vindication had never been the end goal I imagined. What we needed was steadiness and repetition, a small body of evidence consultable again and again. The letter provided a rhythm, a return point as her memory smudged.
2012, A Letter of My Own.
That winter I wrote a letter of my own, practical and moral in equal parts. I explained to my children why I'd chosen our names, why the original letter mattered, and how to preserve documents when truth needs allies. I left instructions on where the original should live and who to notify if anything went missing. Composing the letter felt like closing a loop, not merely an information transfer but a ritual of care, ensuring the next generation had scaffolding against casual cruelty. I addressed practicalities, where the keys lived, which files contained insurance details, and moral guidance about how to respond when their lives were flattened by offhand comments or cruel gossip. The letter was spare but intentional, a bridge across uncertain futures.
Oktober 2014, on the radio.
I am wary of panels that sensationalize, but in October 2014 I accepted a modest invitation to speak on local radio about documenting family truths. Radio in that decade still carried a particular intimacy, voices reaching into cars and kitchens, unadorned and immediate. I spoke plainly about the mundane labor of documentation, photocopies, notarized statements when appropriate, telling people what you remember and asking them to witness it, photographing boxes and drawers. After the segment, a woman approached me with a tremulous scrap of paper. Her father had been cruel in ways her family rationalized, and she had kept no records. She asked what to do. My one practical reply was, begin now. Put what you remember on paper. Make a file. Tell a trusted witness. Ask someone to initial a statement. Begin the ledger.
2013 bis 2016. Children Growing Up.
My children learned these habits in different ways. My daughter kept the scrap in her pocket and grew into someone who could speak up without rancor, who distinguished battles worth fighting from small economies of dignity that do not demand public theater. My son, who liked to rummage, once found an old grocery list my father had written and tucked it into the envelope containing the letter. He was more ordinary than he wanted to appear, my son observed, and we laughed that low familial laugh at reconciled contradiction. We tried to teach them that one person's hurt does not consume a family. Rather, the family can be a structure for repair and memory. Our grandson, born in 2016, knows only the letter's final shape, the framed copy in the hall, the fountain pen beside the cookbooks. When he asked, with childlike bluntness, was he mean on purpose? I answered that sometimes people hurt out of fear, sometimes out of malice, and that explanation is never an excuse. He understood early the difference between explanation and excuse.
2015 bis 2018. Small triumphs of memory.
Quiet triumphs shifted communal memory. At a neighborhood book club in March 2017, a woman who had long been skeptical of our version of events stood up and recalled that my mother had brought meals while her son was ill. The room fell into that hush that arrives when facts rearrange belief. These were not legal victories but amendments to collective memory. Each neighbor who remembered my mother's care, each colleague who corrected the record, each distant relative who shifted tone, they were municipal acts of restitution. Memory, in a small town or a tight neighborhood, is not only private, it is woven into public veins. When enough private acts of remembering become known, they alter the public story. There remained stubborn corners where people preferred tidy, comic versions that reduced a life to a punchline because complexity is hard work. Those conversations revealed less about us than about the storyteller's unwillingness to sit with contradiction. Persuasive labor is finite. I choose where to invest it. When there is willingness to learn, I spend the currency of patience. When there is not, I conserve energy for those who will inherit both the letter and the ethic. Artifacts and levity. The artifacts collected in our home developed lives of their own. The fountain pen beside the cookbooks, an apparently insignificant instrument, wrote both grocery lists and consequential sentences. The grocery list my father had scrawled, ordinary handwriting tucked beside the formal missive, annotated the truth with compassion. Its presence allowed us to hold contradiction without collapse. Placing such ordinary items alongside the letter acknowledged human multitudes. People can be both clumsy and capable of harm. There is a levity that is not flippant but humanizing. Laughing at a contradiction does not excuse it but allows for a fuller view of a person. Practical habits learned and taught. Practical habits turned into a domestic theology. We wrote down dates and times when hurtful remarks were made, noted who was present and how each reacted, saved framed notes, grocery lists, and scraps showing the texture of ordinary life. Important letters were scanned and saved in multiple locations, physical and digital. Trusted third parties were told where keys and documents lived. When harm risked repeating, we sought legal advice earlier than comfort allowed. These were not acts of paranoia but of prudence. The ledger was less about gathering weapons and more about preparing shelter. Small rituals of repair cost nothing but attention. The weekly file night was sustainable because it was steady rather than heroic. Children learned the mechanics of cataloging and, more importantly, the ethic of responsibility for memory. Some nights we inventoried who could corroborate particular memories, an act less about legalism than about communal remembering. Remembering together became a form of love. The ledger as a social instrument. We watched the ledger of our social world shift slowly. People who once laughed recalibrated when presented with steady, mundane evidence. Change arrived incrementally, like geological strata, little factual deposits accreted until the earlier myth diminished. Neighbors who once laughed in kitchens later told stories at book clubs about my mother's care during hard times. These small additions nudged communal memory toward fairness. The ledger was social as much as it was private. It functioned as a civic deposit, a way that households can add to public truth. 2016. My mother's passing. My mother died in early 2016. She had requested a quiet passing, and she received it. The framed copy of the letter remained in its place in the hallway, the original stayed in its drawer. After family members said their goodbyes and the coffee cooled, I read the letter aloud in the room where she kept her hats. Tears and smiles followed. People spoke of her insistence on order in a chaotic world. When the last guest left, I handed a fresh copy of the letter to my daughter and asked her to decide what to keep public and what to tuck away. She received it with immediate gravity. The letter had always been an ordinary object made consequential by ritual. Grief reshaped the ledger again, but the protocols we had established smoothed some of the rough edges.
2016. The attic and the envelope.
In June 2016, during an attic cleanout, my son found that old grocery list and slipped it into the envelope with the letter. We laughed in the way families do when reconciling a person's domestic ordinariness with larger faults. Shame can be softened with levity that does not excuse. Cleaning the attic was an act of stewardship, reclaiming space, arranging artifacts, choosing what to keep and what to let go. The envelope, the scrap, the grocery list, these were not mere relics but tools for future caretakers who would need pathways into things they had not witnessed. 2013 to 2016 and beyond, children and transmission. When I imagine the future, I think of procedures I taught my children and those they will teach theirs. The act of folding a script and tucking in a scrap will continue. In some future kitchen, someone will correct a heading on an envelope and someone else will laugh, "You're insistent on capitals." In that laughter, there will be a lesson. I have tried to leave not only objects, frames, pens, paperwork, but procedures: what to do when rumor becomes dangerous, how to keep a domestic ledger, how to educate neighbors gently about facts. That is the inheritance I hope to pass along. It is an inheritance that is procedural rather than patrimonial, instructions and habits rather than land and titles. Correcting in public, a practice of containment. Over the years I learned that public correction can be a form of soft power. Gentle, literal corrections often diffuse potential social injuries. There are other times to open a drawer and present a document plainly. The skill is discernment, when to speak softly and when to let the file do the talking. Public correction can be surgical rather than theatrical. In doing so we preserve dignity for those harmed and limit the spectacle that feeds cruelty. 2015 to 2018, small triumphs and stubborn corners. Quiet victories continued. At a neighborhood potluck someone remembered my mother bringing homemade soup to a family in crisis. A colleague at work once corrected a joke that would have turned cruel. These were not headline moments. They were, rather, small recalibrations that echoed. Yet there remained stubborn corners of the social map where people preferred a tidy comic version over complexity. Those conversations revealed less about us than about the storyteller's unwillingness to sit with contradiction. Persuasion requires energy. I learned to spend it where it would matter. Practical habits I recommend. I teach my children 3 things: respect the literal truth, protect the person who was harmed, do the clerical work. Speak truth in a calm voice. Tell the harmed person you saw it. Offer to witness their recollection and write it down, or make a copy of anything that matters. Keep the receipts of love and the receipts of harm. Store originals in a safe and copies where a trusted person knows about them. This is not paranoia, it is prudence. Families exist as much by what we decide to remember and defend as by biology or accident. That small, stubborn freedom can steer a life through long arithmetic. Specific habits have been practical and repeatable. Write down dates and times when a hurtful remark was made. Note who was present and how each reacted. Save physical artifacts. Scan important letters and save them in multiple secure locations. Tell a trusted third party where keys and documents are kept. If harm may repeat, seek legal advice earlier than you think you need it. Above all, practice the habits of stories. Tell the truth gently, repeat it when necessary, and ask witnesses to hold what they hear. Repeating a story to people who will remember it builds a communal ledger that is harder to deny. Small rituals of blessing. We developed rituals to mark private victories: a memorized script, a new job, restored confidence. Sticky notes on labeled envelopes, folded scripts, the scrap tucked into a child's palm. These were not theatrics but reaffirmations that what we name at home matters. Those rituals cultivated an ethic of attention and taught children that remembrance is caregiving. They taught us how to make the ordinary into scaffolding for lives that could otherwise be flattened by a moment's cruelty. The letter as living object. The letter remains malleable in the most useful way. Some mornings it reads like a legal document, other mornings it reads like a prayer. Both are true. The little scrap in my daughter's pocket is the most tangible testament to its utility, portable, mnemonic, a prompt for courage when nerves quicken. In the long arithmetic of living, small arithmetic matters. The letter's malleability allows it to meet us where we are, at bedside, at kitchen tables, in attics and on radios. It can be counsel and evidence in the same breath.
Modest Pädagogie.
I have been invited to speak about the letter's practical lessons, clerical care, moral clarity, domestic rituals that sustain truth. I accept only when the conversation will emphasize practical skills. The woman who came to me after the 2014 broadcast with her tear-stained scrap had relief etched into her face. To her and to anyone like her I say the same thing: begin now. Make a They were the ordinary practices that, over time, created a new habit of witnessing. Looking forward. When I imagine the future, I think of procedures I taught my children and those they will teach theirs. The act of folding a script and tucking in a scrap will continue. Someone will straighten a framed copy in the hallway and remark on the capital letters, and another will smile because they understand the labor those capitals represent. I have tried to leave not only objects, frames, pens, paperwork, but procedures: what to do when rumor becomes dangerous, how to keep a domestic ledger, how to educate neighbors gently about facts. That is the inheritance I hope to pass along. A single sentence of advice. If asked for one sentence about surviving being defined by someone else's sloppy speech, I give this: become a steward of memory. Keep the receipts of both love and harm. Choose, again and again, to tell the truth in calm voices. Protect the vulnerable. Make simple clerical acts into moral habits.
Epilogue. The long arithmetic.
The letter is a small monument to that ethic. It is not the end but an instrument for living. Through small gestures, repeated rituals, and careful preservation of ordinary objects we created the freedom to author our own narrative. That freedom, earned in files and envelopes, in a thermos of soup on a winter evening, in a neighbor's book club testimony, in a tiny scrap before a school play, has guided us through the long arithmetic of living.
Grief resurfaces with peculiar appetite.
Sometimes we read the letter together and argue gently about its paragraphs. Other times I read it alone and find a sentence that rings true for the hour. Its malleability keeps it alive as a tool: filing, labeling, witnessing, repeating. These practices make truth harder to erase. And always, in small ways that matter, the domestic ledger accrues. Neighbors who remember kindness, friends who correct the record, children who hold contradiction without collapsing into cynicism. The ledger is not a tally of victories but a map for living. In that map ordinary things, a grocery list, a fountain pen, an envelope labeled in careful capitals, are as important as any headline. They are the artifacts of a quiet, stubborn freedom, the freedom to be known accurately in a world that prefers the punchline. The reader who arrives here late should understand that the moment people most often remember is small and crude. The barbecue when my father, after 6 beers, announced to a circle of relatives and neighbors that I was an accident. That sentence, delivered with the slurred bluntness that alcohol often lends to confession, ricocheted farther than the lawn chairs. It was not the only unkind line he'd ever spoken, but it was the one that moved beyond private family injury into public possession. People laughed, some winced. A few repeated it as joke. That was long before the 2014 broadcast that later amplified the story, and it is long before my mother's quiet death in early 2016. But it is the kind of moment that sets small architectures in motion: the filing of a letter, the drafting of a ritual, the creation of a habit by which a later generation might correct a rumor that seeks to become fact. 2016 to 2017. Securing originals. After we cleaned the attic in June 2016 and my son tucked the grocery list into the envelope with my mother's letter, the next practical step was to secure what could not be secured by memory alone. In the autumn of 2016, I took the original letter to a bank and rented a small safe deposit box. I left a copy with a trusted family friend who lived 2 towns over and made 2 digital scans, one stored on an encrypted cloud service and another on a physically separate external drive. I dated each file and appended a short provenance note, who wrote it, when, where it was kept, and under what circumstances it should be revealed. These acts felt ceremonial and bureaucratic at once. They were modest investments in a future where paper could be misplaced and memory could be weaponized. In February 2017, I had the copy notarized and filed a short affidavit attesting to its authenticity and the context of the barbecue remark. The notarization was not a tactic for litigation but a practical hedge, a way to reduce the distance between rumor and verifiable fact. Notarization made the document legible to institutions that still rely on established chain of custody. I told my children why I had done this, not to shackle them to paperwork, but to create simple affordances for truth. These rituals of authentication became part of our ordinary housekeeping, a chore that felt as essential as oiling the hinges or balancing the checkbook. 2017. Teaching and the neighborhood. That year I began saying yes to invitations to speak in small, practical forums: the public library, a neighborhood association meeting, a women's cooperative at the church. I refused the seductive offers from talk shows that wanted spectacle. I wanted to teach skills. At a library program in April 2017, I demonstrated how to fold a script into an envelope, how to scan a letter and encrypt it, how to create a single page of context that a stranger could read and understand. I told the story sparingly: the barbecue, the 6 beers, the single cruel sentence, the letter tucked into a drawer. People listened in the evening light while rain tapped the windows. Afterwards, several elderly women came forward to say they had been silenced in families for decades and that the idea of a domestic ledger made them feel less alone. 2 neighbors, a retired schoolteacher and a cousin of mine, adopted a version of our practice. They kept copies of what mattered in labeled envelopes, and when a rumor began about a decades-old dispute over a property line, they produced their ledgers to mediate the talk. There was a particular satisfaction in watching unglamorous clerical tools work more effectively than gossip or force of personality. 2018. Containment and an unwanted broadcast. In the spring of 2018, a local radio program picked up an old rumor and turned it into a short segment. The producer wanted sensation, I wanted care. I declined to go on air, but I sent a typed extract from the letter to the show's producer with a note explaining how the facts had been misrepresented. The letter was not a panacea. The producer ran the segment anyway, albeit shortened and with a late correction. Small containment is not the same as total victory. Still, because we had the ledgers and witnesses, a correction aired 3 days later and 4 people who might have otherwise repeated the joke quietly corrected themselves when they heard the factual version. Papers and rituals did the work that argument could not. 2019. Children, school, and ritual transmission. By 2019 my children had internalized the practices I had taught them. My daughter, now in her 30s, made a habit of carrying a small, folded copy of the letter when she attended school board meetings or when she anticipated tense family gatherings. My son taught the practice to his wife before their first child was born. You will not have to fight alone, he said. The ritual of handing a small scrap to a child before a headache-inducing holiday became, at family events, as ordinary as asking someone to pass the salad. One winter morning in January 2019, at a community potluck that had its share of competitive storytelling, a cousin reached for the old pun, the old comic shorthand that reduces people to punchlines. My daughter unfolded a copy of the letter and, in a calm voice, read the relevant paragraph. The room quieted. Some guests apologized, others changed the subject. The harm was not erased, but it was contained quickly and with as little theater as possible. That containment saved certain relationships from having to be broken for the sake of principle. 2020. The pandemic and the digitization of memory. The pandemic of 2020 altered how we practiced the ledger. With gatherings curtailed, the forms of witness shifted online and the risk of misstatement increased as people used social media to make hay from private misfortunes. We adapted. I created a digital protocol, a a time-stamped email with attachments, a copy in a shared family drive with explicit access permissions, and an external hard drive stored at the home of a friend in a different state. We held what we called file nights over video chat, where each person would show an item and speak a few sentences about its provenance and importance. These evenings were less ceremonial than they were practical. We checked backups, updated passwords, and practiced reading one another's statements aloud so that the act of remembrance remained a communal one. The pandemic also clarified who among our neighbors could be trusted as witnesses. One young teacher in the block, who had participated in a library workshop years earlier, became our de facto technical advisor. She helped us encrypt files and set up two-factor authentication. The mundanity of changing a password and the mundanity of correcting a rumor began to look like the same kind of stewardship. 2021, births, anniversaries, and the weight of memory. In the spring of 2021, my grandson was born. On the day his name was announced at a small family gathering, I handed him, in his mother's palm, a folded scrap with a line from my mother's letter. It was an odd transmission, an object of instruction rather than a toy, a piece of paper rather than a blessing. Yet our rituals are practical efficacies more than symbolic acts. To my daughter and son-in-law it read as a promise: items matter, and what we decide to remember shapes what others assume about us. At dinner later that week we talked about how the ledger would need to be updated as new lives entered the family and as social media made both rumor and correction instantaneous.
2022. A family reunion and the limits of correction.
In the summer of 2022 we convened a modest family reunion to mark the anniversary of my mother's passing. My father was there, older and less quick with speech. The old barbecue anecdote, 6 beers, the accident line, had been told and retold enough that a few younger cousins assumed it a kind of family legend. A second cousin, unfamiliar with our procedures, repeated the sentence in a tone that treated it as comic currency. The room shifted. I could have made a spectacle. Instead I asked for a moment and read aloud the paragraph of the letter that named both the context and the harm. I then asked my father if he would like to add anything. He paused, looked at the floor, and said nothing at first. Later that evening he came to the kitchen and, with more clarity than many of his public pronouncements had shown, said to me, "I was careless. I didn't think." It was not an apology crafted for public mending but a quiet accounting toward our private ledger. We accepted it as a partial truth, not grand reconciliation, but a mutual acknowledgement that words have a long tail. There were, of course, others who saw my father's statement as exculpatory rather than confessional. Some argued that alcohol explained everything, others used it as a reason to render the moment impotent. But the ledger did what it was meant to do. It preserved the truth in a place where it could be consulted without the need for daily reinterpretation. That evening affirmed for me that corrections are never absolute. They are pragmatic interventions that limit harm and preserve choices. 2023, institutionalizing practice. By 2023, the practices we began in domestic contexts found their way into civic institutions. A small municipal eldercare program partnered with our neighborhood association to teach document caregiving to caregivers and relatives. I was asked to help outline a simple workshop that could be delivered in 2 hours: how to write a brief statement, how to photocopy and notarize, how to store and communicate. The curriculum was intentionally modest. It did not promise to fix systemic injustices, but it taught tools people could use immediately. In a city where court filings and police reports can be intimidating, the workshop gave everyday people a map for institutionally legible accounts. At the same time, the letter's presence in our home and in our practices began to change how children in the next generation told their stories. My grandson, at 6 years old, learned to say with less shame that he could keep a torn drawing and label it. He watched his mother tuck a paper into an envelope and knew that the act of naming mattered.
2024. Memory, law, and the question of legacy.
Last year, in 2024, I took another modest legal step. I added a short codicil to my will describing the location of the letters, the safe deposit box, and the passwords to digital files. This was not an act of grand foresight but a practical instruction for future stewards. I made a point of attaching a paragraph that emphasized process over content. If the letters are to travel beyond family hands, let it be because the family has consented and because the person's dignity will be preserved. The codicil was read aloud to my children and placed in both the physical ledger and in a digital folder marked, to be consulted upon request. The more we made these choices explicit, the less likely it became that a drunken joke could define us after we were gone. Across these years, I also watched how other families used similar tactics to limit harm. A neighbor used the idea of a pocket scrap to protect a teacher who had been maligned. An acquaintance used notarized statements to correct a viral misattribution. The practices did not stop cruelty, but they redistributed its power. They created resistances that required paperwork rather than gaslighting. As more households learned simple clerical skills, the social economy of rumor shifted. It became harder for a single careless sentence, 6 beers and a cruel line at a barbecue, to ossify into a public truth. Toward a later conclusion. When I think about what endures, I think less of dramatic reversals and more of accumulated small acts. The letter, the envelope, the scrap in a child's pocket. These are mundane tools that, over decades, shape the ledger of a life. They are not guarantees against pain, but they are habits that amplify the possibility of repair. The long arithmetic of living adds and subtracts in ways that are often invisible until you look closely. A corrected rumor here, a notarized page there, a quiet apology in the kitchen. Over time, the ledger grows dense enough that casual cruelty finds fewer purchase points. I continue to teach the same 3 practical tenets I taught my children: respect the literal truth, protect the person who was harmed, and do the clerical work. These are not heroic prescriptions but ordinary disciplines. They are meant to be repeatable, plain, and defensible. In a culture that prizes punchlines and headlines, the stubbornness to keep a file is itself a kind of civic virtue. There will be more anniversaries, more reunions, more summers with barbecues and their unpredictable combinations of alcohol and bravado. There will be grandchildren who ask why a piece of paper can matter so much. I will tell them the same thing I told my children, that small, deliberate habits make it harder for the world to surprise you into misery. For now, the framed copy still hangs in the hallway, the original sits in a safe deposit box, and a tiny scrap lives perpetually in my daughter's pocket. We continue to teach, to notarize, to correct gently when necessary, and to hand these practices forward because the only durable antidote to careless words is steady, communal stewardship of fact and dignity. 2025. From household practice to scholarly interest. In early 2025, a graduate student from the local university's history department emailed me after reading a short piece about our neighborhood workshops in a community newsletter. She wanted to interview families who had adopted the ledger practices for a thesis on private remedies to public rumor. I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because by then the small rituals had begun to feel less like personal superstitions and more like cultural data. The student visited in March, recorded a conversation with my daughter, and asked to see the framed copy in the hallway. Because of the codicil I had added to my will in 2024, we read aloud the paragraph about consent and dignity before she took photographs. She later included an excerpt in a conference paper and, in the footnotes, credited our family for allowing archival access under strict conditions. That exchange produced its own ripple effects. A local museum curator, attending the conference in April, contacted us about a planned exhibit on domestic remedies, how families countered rumor in the early 21st century. We declined public display of the original letter and the family scrap, invoking the stipulation I had placed in the codicil. If these materials were to leave private hands, the family must consent and the person's dignity must be preserved. We did, however, agree to provide a high-resolution facsimile of the relevant paragraph and an audio file of my daughter's reading. The museum mounted the facsimile with a label describing our protocols and the ethics of consent. The audio was played in a quiet corner where visitors could sit and listen. The exhibit opened in September 2025, and the response, measured, thoughtful, occasionally skeptical, confirmed that the practices we had kept at kitchen table scale were beginning to matter as historical objects. 2026. The quiet passing of my father. In the spring of 2026, my father died. He was 89. There was no dramatic reconciliation. He had, in the years since the barbecue and our reading of the letter in 2022, become smaller and less capable of public speech. He did not die with an apology that absolved everyone, nor did he die as a villain. He died as a man who, in his last sober conversations, had said to me in the kitchen, "I didn't think," repeating the partial accounting he had offered at the 2022 reunion. We held a small service in April. The framed copy stayed in the hallway, the original remained in the safe deposit box. After the funeral, my siblings and I read my mother's letter aloud once more, in the living room where she had written it decades earlier. We added a short note to the ledger describing the funeral, who had spoken, and the manner in which my father's statement had been recorded in family practice. These modest entries became part of the archive of ordinary acts that, over time, insist on a particular account of events. The probate process brought another, more procedural kind of clarity. Because of the codicil in my will and because my father's estate was small, there was no dispute about the physical location of the letter or the passwords to the family drive. We used the moment to revisit access permissions and to appoint 2 non-family stewards, the neighbor who had helped us with encryption during the pandemic and the young teacher who had taught document caregiving at the eldercare program. Both agreed to serve as custodial contacts with explicit constraints: no public disclosure without unanimous family consent and no digital release of the original text without redaction for privacy.
2027, Municipal Adoption and the Limits of Governance.
In 2027, the municipal eldercare program that had piloted our 2-hour workshop approached the City Council with a proposal to fund a modest program that would offer free document caregiving sessions at neighborhood centers. The council was receptive in May, citing pilot data the program had compiled, attendance, the number of notarized statements filed, and anecdotal reports of disputes that had been successfully diffused. The program received a small line-item budget for fiscal year 2028. The curriculum remained intentionally modest: how to write a brief factual statement, how to make copies, how to set up access controls, and to choose trusted custodians. The City Council discussion produced a predictable set of objections. Some council members asked whether the city should be in the business of seeding what could be used as legal evidence. Civil libertarians worried the workshops might be exploited to create a bureaucratic veneer over coercive narratives. The program directors responded by underscoring process and consent. These were tools for ordinary people to protect facts about their lives, not a mechanism of state censorship or a substitute for courts. The program launched in January 2028 with a filmed launch event at the community center, attended by my daughter, who spoke briefly about the way a pocket scrap had changed how we managed family gatherings. The city-sponsored workshops did not eliminate disputes, but they made it easier for people to signal to one another that an account existed, that it had been dated and witnessed, and that it could be consulted.
2028, New Technologies, New Harms.
By 2028, the landscape had shifted again. Generative media technologies, voice cloning, deepfakes, hyper-realistic composite images, made new kinds of misstatements easier to produce and harder to disprove. A cousin who had once joked about 6 beers, found a short, doctored audio clip online purporting to show a family member repeating the phrase with sinister emphasis. The clip circulated in private message groups and then briefly appeared on a local talk show. The speed at which such content could spread made me, and many others, scramble for technical defenses we had not needed in 2019. Our neighborhood's eldercare teacher helped draft an update to the workshop curriculum that autumn: how to create air-gapped backups, how to timestamp statements with third-party services, and how to create simple cryptographic hashes that could prove a file's authenticity without revealing its full content. I met with a small team of volunteers in September to test a process, record a reading of a letter, upload a hash to a trusted timestamping service, and keep the original on an offline encrypted drive held by a custodial friend in another state. We taught this protocol at 2 community centers that winter. The measures were not foolproof, no defenses, but they made it harder for a single manufactured clip to overwrite a contemporaneous, time-stamped, witnessed account. The rise of these technologies also generated a new set of questions about publicness and pedagogy. A local bar association reached out in November 2028 to collaborate on template language that families could use to describe in plain English what a notarized statement could and could not do. Lawyers cautioned against promising legal outcomes. Social workers emphasized the social value of documentation. The templates focused on process again: how to identify witnesses, how to keep multiple redundancy, how to codify consent. 2029, a public dispute and the practical value of the ledger. In the summer of 2029, an episode tested our practices in a public forum. A video posted by a distant cousin, edited, sensationalized, captioned to encourage outrage, recycled the accident anecdote and claimed an older family member had long confessed to ruining my mother's reputation. The video went semi-viral in a local network and prompted an invitation for a televised afternoon segment that promised to clear the family record. My daughter, who by then had been trained to approach such moments with procedural calm, declined the invitation. Instead, we issued a short, factual statement. We provided the date-stamped facsimile of the paragraph from my mother's letter, made available under the terms of our codicil. We produced a notarized affidavit from the friend who had witnessed the reading in 2022, and we used the time-stamped hash we had created in 2028 to prove the continuity of our files. The television producers, faced with documentary evidence and a family unwilling to engage in sensationalism, backed away from inflammatory framing. The distant cousin removed the video after a series of emailed requests from our appointed stewards and later, after a private mediation in which accounts were clarified. There was no theater of public apology. The episode resolved as a practical correction rather than a morality play. To some viewers the outcome seemed small. To others it was a demonstration of a larger point. When a family has invested in a straightforward, repeatable protocol, dated statements, witnesses, notarization, and off-site backups, rumor loses its velocity. 2030, schools, civics, and passing the practice forward. By 2030 the city school district included a brief module on document caregiving in 9th grade civics classes. The material was not a legal primer but a civic one, how small acts of record-keeping could protect dignity and reduce harm in personal networks. Teachers told stories, sometimes anonymized, about how a notated account had prevented a false social media storm in a high school, or how a pocket scrap had diffused a holiday argument. My grandson, now 9, heard his mother's reading in a classroom for a school unit on family archives. He rolled his eyes in the way that children do, but he kept his own small folded scrap in a pencil box. The language of the workshop, literal truth, protection of the harmed person, clerical work, entered into children's conversations. That year I taught a single session at a high school with my daughter's permission. We showed a facsimile of the letter and asked students to draft their own one-paragraph statements about a time when words had mattered. The curriculum's modest success reinforced the pragmatic nature of the project. We did not promise that notarized statements would resolve deep injustices or that a pocket scrap could counteract systemic power. Rather, we insisted that ordinary people deserve ordinary tools that make it harder for rumor to calcify. That approach appealed to classroom teachers, who teach process repeatedly in ways that executive summaries and viral posts rarely do.
2031, Succession and the Archive.
In early 2031, I completed another practical step. I drafted an addendum to the codicil that named specific successors to steward the physical and digital ledger after my death: my daughter, my son, and the 2 appointed custodians who had been part of the encryption work. The addendum reiterated the family's consent clause and added an instruction about eventual archival transfer. The original letter could be deposited in a local historical society only if the society agreed to a closed-access embargo for 30 years unless every named family steward consented to earlier release. The point was simple: archives matter, but consent matters too. We wanted the historical record to be accessible to historians who could place our practices in context, while also ensuring that private dignity was not sacrificed for the sake of curiosity. In June 2031, the Neighborhood Historical Society accepted the terms and, with our permission, digitized a high-quality facsimile of the letter for restricted scholarly use. A graduate seminar from the university requested permission to study the files in 2032. We approved access under the conditions of the codicil and the addendum. These small acts of transfer felt less like putting the matter to rest and more like appointing interpreters for future readers.
2032. Looking back, looking forward.
By the beginning of 2032, the ledger had accumulated an archive of entries, notarized statements, time-stamped hashes, copies of the piece of the museum exhibit, descriptions of reunions, and modest appendices that described technical processes. The practices had not ended meanness or erased the harm caused by careless words, but they had reallocated the energy required to transform rumor into accepted fact. Where once a single glib sentence, "He had 6 beers and said it was an accident," could embed itself in family lore and public imagination, the presence of the ledger required that any such claim be met with a question: where is the record, who witnessed it, and who consented to sharing it? There are important continuities I watch in these later years. People still tell jokes at barbecues. Alcohol still sometimes loosens tongues. Memory still betrays or reshapes itself. But the cultural habit of keeping a small, dated, witnessed note has made it harder for the loudest voice at a gathering to define the truth. The habit is not heroic, it is repetitive and domestic. It requires time, writing a few sentences, finding a witness, making a copy, and a kind of stubbornness to prioritize process over performance. That stubbornness, across a dozen modest interventions and over the course of more than a decade, has had cumulative effect. There are, of course, new challenges I cannot predict in exact detail. Laws will change, technologies will shift, new social media forms will present new temptations and new avenues for harm. But the practices I have taught my children and grandchildren, respect the literal truth, protect those who are harmed, and do the clerical work, translate across these transformations. They are not salvation, they are a method, a family technology for preserving dignity. When I teach a workshop now, in my late 70s, I often end with a practical exercise. Participants write a paragraph about a time when words mattered, they read it aloud to a witness, and they sign a simple log noting the date and the witness's name. The room tends to grow quiet during that exercise. It is a small act but a charged one. It asks people to invest a few minutes in fixing a fact against future erasure. In those minutes I am thinking of my mother at her kitchen table composing a letter that would outlast gossip, of my father's careless line that required a long tale of correction, of my daughter's persistent habit of keeping a scrap in her pocket, and of grandchildren who may never know the exact shape of the quarrel but who will inherit a set of practices that make it less likely they will be defined by someone else's offhand cruelty. I cannot promise that a single method will repair every wrong. But I can attest that repeated, small acts of care, dating a statement, preserving a copy, appointing a steward, accumulate into a local infrastructure of truth. They make it harder for a throwaway sentence at a summer barbecue to ossify into a public fact. They do not erase the sting of what was said, but they offer a steadying structure through which future accounts can be judged and, when necessary, corrected with dignity and with witnesses. There remains work to be done, lessons to pass on, and heirs to appoint, and so we continue these practices not as a final answer but as an ongoing civic habit that, I hope, will outlast any one of us. In 2033 the ledger moved from being a family practice into an evidentiary habit that courts and reporters began to notice, though with characteristic ambivalence. A municipal magistrate in March cited the notarized sequence from our files in a hearing about a defamation claim and described the bundle, date-stamped facsimile, witness affidavit, off-site custody logs, as helpful corroboration, while reminding the courtroom that such materials did not replace live testimony or the fact-finding that judges and juries still perform. A local editor ran an essay in May asking whether a culture of small, routinized record-keeping might create new hierarchies of credibility. Academics replied by pointing out that the practice made credibility contestable rather than settled by rumor. The modest verdict, as the magistrate framed it, was that documentation had practical purchase without offering an absolute shield. Practical refinements followed. In the winter of 2034, a coalition of archivists and privacy advocates produced an updated template for family codicils that addressed concerns raised in clinics and classrooms. The new language clarified access protocols, spelled out redaction procedures for sensitive medical or sexual history material, and strengthened the consent clause to require periodic reaffirmation every 5 years. We adopted the template in our addendum, scheduling a review in 2036. The revision was not about fortifying a legal fortress, it was about keeping the work administrable and ethically attentive to the people it concerned. Technological changes also nudged practice. By 2035, distributed timestamping services had matured. Multiple independent notaries could co-sign hashed records so that a single failed provider would not obliterate continuity. We integrated a two-provider model into our off-site backups and taught it at a community center in April. My grandson, who had folded a scrap into his pencil box in 2030, was then 15 and, like many teenagers, more interested in code than in family quarrels. Still, he understood redundancy. He volunteered to help my daughter manage the encrypted mirror in his spare time and took pride in learning why a second timestamp mattered. There were predictable critiques. Some lawyers and survivors' advocates argued in 2036 that codified household archives might be weaponized by abusers seeking to preempt accountability. Others worried that formalization would freeze narratives that needed to evolve. I listened to each concern and pushed for mitigations built into the process, explicit clauses that prohibited preemptive releases designed to intimidate, mandatory cooling-off periods before any publicly disclosed item could be amplified, and an ombud's role in our stewarding group to advise on potential harms. The policy adjustments were not universal cures, but they reflected a continuing ethic. The method must protect dignity rather than be an instrument of control. Institutions began to absorb the language of the ledger in small ways. In late 2037, the public library advertised a family records night modeled on our workshop. By 2038, several town clerks kept brochures describing notarization basics alongside marriage license forms.